I'm Don Sanford, the program chair for the Peoria World Affairs Council, and we would also like to thank the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute at Bradley and the Global Studies Program Institute here at Bradley for the three of us being able to present this opportunity to hear from Ambassador Ford today. I'm not going to spend a lot of time because it would take me 15 minutes to do adequate introduction of Ambassador Ford. I've had the pleasure of getting to know him. He is a former ambassador to Syria, although I think his former ambassadors will tell you, I don't know if you're ever former, because all the ones I know from countries always go back regular and always called to speak on behalf of those countries and what's going on. I will tell you, if you get the book titled The Ambassadors, or I think it's Ambassadors, it talks about the diplomats who are called upon to go to the toughest assignments that the United States has. And Ambassador Robert Ford is prominently one of the four that are talked about in the book. So he is not one to shout his praises, but I will, and I give thanks every day I've had the opportunity to get to know such a wonderful individual. All right, now we want to spend our time talking about Syria, Ambassador Ford.
So while they're working on the video technical issue, let me just say a couple of things about what's happening in Syria. The civil war, which started in 2011, is not officially over. There hasn't been any kind of a peace agreement. There hasn't been an Appomattox moment where one side surrenders to the other, nothing like that. Instead, the war has just kind of, in fits and starts, worn down and quieted substantially. Instead of dozens of people being killed every day, sometimes hundreds at the peak of the fighting in 2014 and 2015, now there's an incident or two around the country every day, so that the daily casualty rate would be in the single digits on a normal day. Most of the major cities of Syria, the ones that you would have heard about, like Damascus or Aleppo, are quiet. The government controls them. I have a map in a minute. I hope to show who controls what in Syria. But for the most part, the fighting has largely ended, and the country is shattered in the sense that there isn't any large-scale reconstruction underway, nothing like, say, Europe, Western Europe, after World War II, when France, Belgium, Germany, Italy began rebuilding. There is no such thing happening in Syria right now. Infrastructure, things like electricity, clean water, the infrastructure was heavily damaged during this war. For the most part, that has not yet been restored. So satellites that fly over the Middle East during the nighttime in the Middle East will notice lots of bright lights next door in Israel or in Jordan to the south of Syria, or in Turkey to the north of Syria. But Syria itself is still largely very dark at night because there isn't much electricity. Some of the wealthier families would have generators that they run on diesel, but that's the exception, not the rule. So in March, I was invited to go to Syria with a British organization. The British organization is called Intermediate. It's based in London. It's managed, directed by a guy who was British Prime Minister Tony Blair's chief of staff while Blair was Prime Minister. The Intermediate boss's name is Jonathan Powell. Intermediate is a very low-key, quiet conflict resolution organization that tries to bring warring parties together. They were heavily involved, for example, in the Northern Ireland peace process, which they then, once it got going, they handed off to Bill Clinton and George Mitchell. who did the final negotiations between the Irish Republican Army and the Sinn Féin on one side and the British government on the other side. So Intermediate asked if I would join them on a trip to Syria in March, just a little under 2 months ago. End of March I went, during the spring break at Yale University, where I've been teaching. We were going into the far northwest corner of Syria, facing Turkey, not at all far from the Mediterranean Sea. It's an area, it's a province in Syria called Idlib. Idlib has been the scene of a lot of fighting, and there is still an occasional airstrike or an ambush by one side or the other in Idlib. It's one of the places where there's still a bit of fighting going on, unlike, say, the capital Damascus or the second largest city, Aleppo, where, although they're shattered physically, there isn't really much fighting. But in Idlib, there's a bit here and there. Idlib is controlled, the northern part of Idlib, closer to Turkey, is controlled by the Turkish army, which has soldiers there, about 11,000 inside Syria, and militant groups on the ground, Syrian militant groups, both backed by Turkey directly and some that operate under the umbrella, the protection of the Turkish army. It's the Turkish army really that keeps the Syrian army from taking over the rest of Idlib. There's a tenuous sort of ceasefire right now, which the Russians worked out between Turkey and the Syrian government. And for the most part, they honor the ceasefire. There are occasional violations, as I mentioned. That part of Syria, Idlib province, is also where the earthquake from February, the February 5 earthquake, struck very hard. And I've put up, for those who can see it, a map of where the earthquake struck in both Turkey and in Syria. And those looking at the map, if you look at the brown area, that's Idlib, right in the center of the map. I crossed into Syria there at the little crossing point in red called Bab el-Hawa. That's where we went in to Syria. That area is controlled by a militant group, which is called the Organization to Liberate Syria. That militant group is actually on the American government terrorism list. I put it there when I was the American ambassador to Syria in 2012. So it was a little strange walking into an area controlled by a terrorist group. And we stayed in Idlib for 3 nights, talking to people and trying to get a sense of how they were doing in the wake of the earthquake, how were humanitarian aid flows, and what the situation was. I'm throwing up a picture now for those who can see it of the Turkish city of Antakya that we went through to get to the Bab el-Hawa crossing. Antakya, for those interested in ancient Christian history, beginnings of the Christian church, that is the city of Antioch, which was very important to the early Christian church. It's now part of southern Turkey, very close to the Syrian border. And Antakya was basically I take it that the picture is up on the screen, maybe?
Yes, the picture is, and let me mention that I did a class on Turkey, the second Holy Land, and so Antioch got quite a bit of coverage. So yes, but there's a few in the room that know exactly where it's at.
Yeah, so I'll just, for those in the room, so Idlib province is where I went in Syria, and Antioch is just inside Turkey, just to the upper left of the Turkish-Syrian border, facing Idlib. This is where the earthquake struck in both southern Turkey and in northwestern Syria. So we drove through Antioch, and it really was shocking, the damage. I didn't see a single building that looked like it was inhabitable. It's really a tragedy there. So as I talk about the really horrible impact of the earthquake in Syria, I don't want to minimize the suffering on the Turkish side of the border. So one of the towns that we went to is Haram. This is just inside Syria, on the other side of the border from Turkey. Heavy damage. And we were there 6 weeks after the earthquake, but there was rubble everywhere. The people there really don't have a lot of heavy equipment. They don't have loaders and bulldozers in great numbers to haul away rubble. In fact, when we went by here, there were some people praying at the site of what I presume were their family members who were buried alive when these buildings came down. This was about a 3 or 4 block stretch of apartment buildings that were brought down during the earthquake. And we saw incidents like this regularly in Idlib province.
Ambassador Ford, it was
Yeah.
mentioned to me, if you can slide across at the top and click on slideshow, we'll get your full picture.
Okay, will do. Just a second.
It'll get rid of the
How's that?
side.
Is that better?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, great. So when we were in Haram and other cities which we visited in Idlib province, tent camps were already springing up. The tents are not coming from the international community. They have been coming mainly from Turkey. The United Nations was very slow to mobilize help to go into this part of Syria. They sent a lot of help to Damascus, where there really wasn't any earthquake damage. And other countries flew in plane loads of humanitarian aid to Damascus under the control of the Syrian government, but almost none of it came up to Idlib province. And so the real providers of humanitarian assistance that we saw, such as these tents, was the Turkish Red Crescent. These tent cities were going up rapidly, managed not by, when I emphasize this point, managed not by Turks, although we saw a few Turks, but managed by Syrian, both Syrian Red Crescent and humanitarian aid volunteers, but also by professional people, white-collar managers who work for that terrorist organization I mentioned. So that it was interesting because although when we put them on the terrorism list in 2012, they really were a subsidiary of Al-Qaeda and Al-Qaeda in Iraq, but they have metamorphosized into something resembling a government. And so it was kind of strange to be talking to these guys from a terrorist organization, and they're the ones that are setting up the tents and organizing toilets and organizing water supplies and food drop-offs, and they had clipboards instead of AK-47s. So the Syrian war has morphed in many ways. And I would just emphasize to people that this is another tent city outside of town up there in Idlib. Even before the earthquake, as I mentioned, Idlib was the scene of a lot of fighting, and Syrians from other parts of the country, from the southern parts of the country around the capital, Damascus, or around Aleppo, or the third largest city, Homs, have gone up into this area trying to escape the Syrian government army, which is, of course, exceptionally brutal and repressive. And so Idlib, which before the civil war had a population of less than 1 million, right now has a population of about 4.5 million. It's gone up 4.5 times. And so there are tent cities throughout Idlib. And these, as you can see, are much older tents, which were provided by the United Nations Commission for Refugees. That's what the UNHCR, written in blue on these older tents, are. And so there are a lot of these tent cities. Even before the earthquake, there were a lot of tent cities. And of course, people have been living in these tents now, in many cases, for 8 or 9 years. And it does snow in Idlib during the winter, and of course, often rains as well. And so this is just not a happy living situation that people have been stuck in for many years now, and really without any prospect of it getting better. I don't want to leave the impression with people that Idlib up there in northwest Syria is just a total basket case. I think one of the things that surprised me the most was that there's actually a lot of commercial activity and business. Syrians are very entrepreneurial, very much like Lebanese. They are very into small-scale private family-owned businesses and setting up businesses, very entrepreneurial. And Idlib had a real kind of, how would I say it, a vibrant commercial life, even though it's only about 6 miles from where the Syrian army is. So it's practically on the front line. It's a city of approximately 500,000 now. It's big. I mean, before the war in 2011, the population of Idlib was probably about 200,000. It's not in this picture, but just to the right of where the picture is, there are several buildings that were bombed during the fighting in the Civil War. But I was surprised how much traffic there was and how many people were on the streets and how many shoppers there were at the stores. It's not a complete basket case, is the point I'm trying to make. So I just mentioned one other thing on the political side. So this is the head of that terrorist group that controls most of Idlib province. His name is Abdulkader Jolani. The United States government put him on our terrorism list, right up there with Al-Qaeda and others, in December of 2012. He has, over the last 2 years, sort of changed his profile, changed his act. I have to say, we have no instances of Jolani and his group attacking any targets outside of Syria since 2013. We have no reports of them killing any non-combatants since about 2015. He actually, this picture of him is taken from an interview that he did with public television, U.S. public television, PBS, in 2021. And he has now several years ago denounced any connection to Al-Qaeda. He says he has no loyalty to them whatsoever. It was a formal break. He also engaged in active combat, real fighting with people killed on both sides between this guy and his group and the Islamic State, ISIS. Jolani here prevailed in Idlib. He not only prevailed, but they kicked ISIS out of northwestern Syria, which is why we're fighting them to this day in eastern Syria. So in a sense, I would almost call Jolani a success story for the American terrorism list, in that he clearly wants to get off the list. He has reached out, and he's forsworn terrorism verbally, but as best we can tell, he is actually implementing that. He's keeping his word in terms of what he's doing on the ground. When I was there, I met a group of Christians who live in Idlib province, and I asked them how it was going with, living under this guy here. He's very much an Islamic fundamentalist. I mean, I would say half the women I saw were wearing face veils, and almost all women, I don't think I saw a single woman whose hair was uncovered, not a single one in 3 days. So I asked these Syrian Christians how it was going with him, and they said it was much worse 7 or 8 years ago, but in the last year, Jolani and his group have returned all houses that were seized from Christians during the peak of the fighting, 2015, 2016, say. They have all received their homes back. They are now starting to get farmland, which they owned, also returned. And they are able to hold their church services without any interference. In fact, two of the people we were talking to were Franciscan monks. Said the Islamic fundamentalists don't interfere with their church services. They leave them alone, but, and this is important, they are not allowed to ring church bells ever. They are not allowed to have any Christian symbolism, no crucifixes or anything outside of the church in public display. If it's in your home, that's okay. If it's in your church, that's okay, but absolutely not on the street. No symbolism of Christianity on the exterior walls of the church. People will know that it's a church. It'll say, you know, church, but it's no symbolism, no church bells. It has to remain discreet on a level. So as one guy said, he said, we were just absolutely drowning here 5 or 6 years ago. He said, now at least we can breathe. So I think this is also just part of the new and improved Jolani trying to sort of show that he's turned a leaf. So, Don, I'm going to stop there because I think you and I were going to talk about some other things.
Well, yeah, and I definitely want to focus on what you were sharing with me last night when we talked about Iran and Syria and the Israeli reactions. So if you'd like to talk about that now.
Yeah, so I hope people can see this map of who controls what in Syria. And the area that's circled, that's where I was, up in Idlib province. That's where Jolani and the earthquake area was. I did not go outside of that area. So I didn't go into the area that the government controls, which is in the purple. Frankly, if I were to go in the government controlled area, I'm sure I'd be arrested very quickly for my strong anti-Bashar al-Assad stance. So, and I didn't go into the yellow areas, which the United States and a Syrian Kurdish faction control. It was a bit distant from where we were. So, but the key thing is, if you can see on this map, the flags with the green horizontal line and then a white line in the center and a red line at the bottom. That's, of course, the Iranian flag. And this shows basically where the Iranians have bases. And so they have a lot of bases in the government-controlled parts of Syria. Iran is a big ally of President Bashar al-Assad. And people might notice that there are a lot of maps over on the eastern side of Syria on roads coming out of Iraq. And that's not an accident. The Iranian government sends supplies and weaponry across Iraq and into Syria on those roads, and then station them in places like the capital city Damascus on the far southwestern side of Syria. You could see it there, the capital city Damascus, and down close to the Israeli border, the occupied Golan, Quneitra, and even down close to Jordan at a place called Dara. And the Israelis are exceptionally sensitive to these weapons movements that the Iranians are undertaking. And the Israelis have been striking at Iranian targets. The Israeli Air Force has been striking at Iranian targets almost every week now. This is an unprecedented scale of Israeli airstrikes in Syria. When I was the ambassador in Syria in 2011, maybe the Israelis struck a target maybe once every 6 months, and they would do it very discreetly. They would never comment on it. Now they strike them almost every week, and the Israelis don't hide it anymore. They're very open about it. In fact, yesterday, the Israeli defense minister said they have doubled the number of airstrikes against Iran during the past year over the preceding year. This is a real flashpoint because so far the Iranians have not fired back very much. They just kind of, 5, 6 guys will get killed in an airstrike. Maybe a few trucks or a warehouse gets blown up. The Iranians don't retaliate. My read on that is that the Iranians know that they'd really get pounded hard by the Israelis if the fighting got going big. And so the Iranians hold their fire. But we don't know exactly where the Iranian red line is. And the Russians are, of course, there. And the Russians have now started complaining, both privately and publicly, to the Israelis in a way they did not do 3 or 4 years ago, about these airstrikes. I don't think Russia's looking to start a big war with Israel in Syria, but again, red lines, when countries don't know where other countries' red lines are, the possibilities for unexpected escalation are much greater. So this Israeli Iranian tit for tat stuff so far hasn't really extended much to the United States, but if you look again at the eastern side of Syria, where that government-controlled purple space meets the yellow American-controlled space in eastern Syria, Iranian militias there have on occasion launched either drone attacks or missile attacks, rocket attacks against some of the American forward operating bases in that yellow controlled space right close to where the city of Deir ez-Zor is located. And in fact, an American citizen, and he was a contractor working for the US military and logistics, was killed in one of those drone strikes back in March. And President Biden then ordered a large retaliatory set of American airstrikes down right on that border between Syria and Iraq at Abu Kamal, where that white diamond is. That's where the Americans struck back very hard and blew up several Iranian militia warehouses and killed about 20 Iranian fighters. So that's kind of an ongoing little tit for tat, and it's a direct outgrowth of Iran's intervention and American intervention in the Syrian civil war. I think that's all I'm going to say about this, Don. I'm happy to take questions later or now. Or
I do have one question though before we go on. Back to the Christian situation there. I had one of the questions on the chat was, are there any public Christian gatherings allowed?
No.
Okay.
So like you could not do, for example, a Christmas procession or an Easter procession. Jelani and his organization to liberate Syria would not allow that.
This map is the best one for me that you've had yet. That really does a great job of explaining currently where a lot of the countries and groups have their greatest influence, which is for us always hard to tell in Syria. You know what? I'm going to skip the normalization with Assad for the moment, because definitely want to get into then what the Americans are doing in Syria, and then we wanted you to talk a little bit about the idea of sanctions on Syria and Assad.
Yeah. So, well, let me just say a few things about the Americans. And the number of American soldiers in that yellow part of eastern Syria is about 900. So it's obviously not nearly enough to control by themselves what's going on there. They are there really just chasing little remnant bands of ISIS, of the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria. And when I say little bands, I mean, I'm talking about they're going after twosies and threesies, tiny little groups. You'll occasionally see a statement put out by the Pentagon or by the American Central Command, which does Middle East. They're based out of Tampa, Florida. Where they say, oh, we killed an ISIS leader over here. They're often in the areas around Raqqa and Deir ez-Zor. You can see those on the map, very close to where the Syrian government operates. And they might, kill a guy, and but these little remnants of ISIS can always replace him. Killed one guy, and the next day another guy takes his place. They don't. You can read about this in detail. There's every quarter the inspectors general of the Defense Department and the State Department put out a joint report on how this is going. And if you just Google Operation Inherent Resolve Inspector General report, you can read these. They're long, full of, because they're a Pentagon operation, essentially full of nice pictures and nice graphs. State Department could never afford the software to do that. But the Pentagon has lots of money, so they can do it. And they're nice reports. I mean, they're very readable. And but what strikes me what interests me the most is in their assessment of how strong or how dangerous these little bands of ISIS are. For the last 5 quarters, these Inspector General reports say ISIS does not have the capability to attack the United States. It does not have the capability to attack our allies in Western Europe. They still operate in very small numbers. They have not been completely eradicated, but they are, for the most part, essentially neutralized, which leads me to wonder, how long are we going to keep these 900 soldiers who occasionally get shot at by the Iranians? I don't know. It's not real clear to me what's the condition under which we would bring them home. This is the kind of forever war that a lot of people say the United States needs to declare victory and go home. So one other little interesting thing about the remnants of ISIS, you see that, that kind of purple space there, that's what the Syrian government controls. And if you look almost dead center in that purple space, you'll see the ancient city of Palmyra, which was a Nabatean civilization, dates back to before the Romans, to the Greeks. So it was its own empire connected to Petra, to those of you who've been to Jordan and seen Petra. So anyway, Palmyra is that area in the center of what a region in Syria called Badia is. There are still a lot of ISIS there. They're not operating in twosies and threesies. They're operating in 20s and 30s. And they do regularly ambush both Iranian militias and the Syrian army when it sends patrols. They actually killed a bunch of Syrian civilians who went out into the desert hills to collect a kind of mushroom, which grows in the early spring with the rainfall and the dew that collects. And the farmers sell these things to make money, and several dozen got killed. So there, ISIS is still operating, but that's not, they're so far inside where the Syrian government controls it, the Americans never ever go there. And so while we have sort of essentially fixed the ISIS problem on our side of Syria, where the Syrian government operates, it's still a much bigger threat, but there's nothing the Americans can do to make that go away. And in a sense, it makes me wonder, like, how long are we going to be in Syria? We can't really fix the ISIS problem in Syria because so much of it is an area that the government controls. So again, anytime I've written or spoken about this publicly, I just say we need to define the conditions under which finally you bring these American special forces home, about 900 soldiers. I'm going to stop there, Don.
Okay. We have some questions here. And you answered that one. Are there any comments on the current Turkey election and what impact that might have on the Syria-Turkey border?
Yeah. So just a quick thing on Turkey and Syria. So Turkey shares a 700-mile-long border with Syria. And inside Turkey, there are 3.5 million Syrian refugees in a country whose population is about 82, 83 million. So it would be sort of like if in the United States, we had 14 or 15 million refugees, say from Mexico or something, who had come here because of a civil war in Mexico. So Turkey is very, very, very interested in what's going on in Syria. In this map I've got up, in the yellow zone there, with all the little American flags, you will notice there's a brown stripe horizontal that goes along the a portion of the Syrian-Turkish border. That is controlled directly by the Turkish army. And then in that green area around Idlib, where I visited, again, the Turkish army was in control of that space too. So the Turks control a lot of territory right up along the Turkish-Syrian border. So a huge political issue in the Turkish presidential campaign is what to do with all these Syrian refugees. And although I don't think the criticism is fair, there is a perception especially among the Make Turkey Great Again crowd, and there is quite a big one in Turkey, Make Turkey Great Again, to kick all of these 3.5 million Syrian refugees out. And the discussion, especially the opposition candidate, Kılıçdaroğlu, not sure he's going to win, but he is, particularly in the last week after the runoff campaign started, he's saying, I'm going to promptly throw out those 3.5 million refugees, and we're going to send them back in to Turkey, and we'll start by sending them into these areas where the Turkish army controls, which is again that brown horizontal stripe in east central Turkey, and then this area in northwest Turkey that they control. I don't know if the Turks would actually do that as opposed to just a campaign promise, but there are regular now acts of individual violence against Syrian refugees. I would say on average 1 or 2 Syrian refugees is murdered by Turkish gangs in Istanbul or down along the border in cities like Gaziantep. Turkey has become a much, much more unpleasant place for Syrian refugees than it was 7, 8, or 9 years ago. The other thing I would just say is President Erdogan has, I would put this diplomatically, an unorthodox set of economic policy tools that he's trying to use to deal with very high inflation. It's about 45% right now in Turkey, down from 90%, I guess. That's an achievement. And the Turkish economic outlook is pretty grim, both in terms of employment and in terms of economic growth. That's going to make things even harder for Syrian refugees because they'll get blamed for a lot of it, just as in the United States. Immigrant populations are often blamed for difficult economic conditions. So I think at least as far as the Syria angle goes, it's not good in Turkey, but were I a Syrian refugee, I would certainly be rooting for Tayyip Erdogan, who has not made the same kind of screeching promises about promptly throwing refugees back. Erdogan says they have to go, but he doesn't give any kind of timeline.
Okay. If you have any questions out here, I'll get to you shortly. So, but we do have several in the chat. Let's go to, oh, yeah, on the humanitarian aid, you know, when I was following and then when I was talking with my Turkish contacts there was a lot of frustration about getting any aid into Syria, that Turkey had kind of slowed things down along with the Syrian government. How have things been in terms of coming in from the Turkish side? And so, what about the aid coming into the Turkey area?
The good news for the Turks was that their biggest airports, in particular at Gaziantep, were not badly damaged. And so countries and the United Nations and others, the United States, could fly aid in pretty quickly and started doing so within 48 hours of the earthquake. The Turks did not make a big effort to get humanitarian aid into northwestern Syria, into Idlib, in the immediate days after the earthquake. And the United Nations did absolutely nothing. And so for about 5 or 6 days, people in Idlib were really on their own. And of course, that's when people are buried under buildings and you have a very limited time to get them out. There was no heavy equipment, almost to do that. And so there were a lot of deaths in the first few days after the earthquake as well. I think by the time we got there in March 23rd, 24th, Turkish aid was flowing in more. I still didn't see any United Nations. In 3 days, driving all over Idlib province, north, south, east, west, I only saw one single UN Jeep. And I saw no UN trucks, I saw nothing. And we were at the Bab el-Hawa crossing several different times during our 3 days there. And we saw very little truck traffic coming in from Turkey. That's where the humanitarian aid would go through. Really, people in Idlib were largely left on their own. I don't want to blame the Turks too much because what aid we did see did come from Turkey.
All right. Can you explain how much continuity there is in our diplomatic relationships when the U.S. has a new president? How do we maintain positive friendships? You've gone through this. New administration comes in, new policy. What difficulties, especially, does that give to you and the Foreign Service?
Well, the way it should work, and really, America's changed a lot in 15 years, but I'm old enough to remember, and I bet many people with us today remember, the saying that foreign policy, or that policy disagreements and political disagreements stop at the water's edge. Stop at the water's edge, and that Americans used to sort of take pride in projecting an image of unity when they dealt with foreign countries. Republicans and Democrats essentially had very similar policies on a lot of things. And that was true during the time of, say, Richard Nixon. That was true during the time of Gerald Ford. Maybe not so much during the time of Jimmy Carter, but even during the time, say, of George Herbert Walker Bush. For the most part, Republicans and Democrats didn't sharply disagree about foreign policy. And that even extended into the administration of Bill Clinton. Did Clinton have a lot of problems with Republicans? Absolutely. But on domestic stuff, not on foreign affairs. I have to say, in the last 10 years, that has just hugely changed. And the partisan sniping that goes back and forth does infect foreign policy now. And just to give you an example, look at this map of Syria. That was Obama who sent in those troops. And there were 2,000 by the time Obama left. When Trump came into office, he initially said, we're pulling them all out. And that caused such an uproar at the Pentagon and at the State Department that then Defense Secretary Jim Mattis resigned. Jim Mattis had been, of course, a general in the Iraq War and a Marine, and was exceptionally well respected from his time in Iraq. And he got so mad at Trump for just reversing this policy without beginning to understand it that Mattis just quit. That's why he left the administration. Trump had at least 2 more defense secretaries during his final year and a half in office. So Biden has come in, and at least on the Syria side, he hasn't changed the policy much from where Trump left it. There's still about 900 soldiers there. It's roughly the number that were there when Trump left. Unlike Trump, Biden doesn't say he's going to pull them out anytime soon. The most important thing in terms of having a good transition in a bilateral relationship with a foreign country when we change presidents is that the policy not shift 180 degrees on the first day of the new administration. It's not to say that you can't change policies. Obviously, for example, we've changed with China over the last 10 years. But it's more gradual rather than sharp, sudden moves. And certainly you don't make foreign policy by Twitter. That would be Ford's first rule of foreign policy in the modern world. Twitter is not the medium, the diplomatic channel of preference in international relations.
I know it should be Facebook, right? All right, I've got one more question on here, and then I'll see here in the audience. And I know we need to let you go before too long because your wife has a lot of chores for you to get done before you come here to Illinois. Tony Rice has a good question. How do you verify or ascertain the sincerity of someone like Jelani, who states that he has, in essence, change? Where does the intel observations come from to try to get a handle on that?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And of course, that's the whole point is, I think it was Ronald Reagan who said trust but verify when he was talking to Gorbachev at the end of the Soviet Union's period. So trust but verify, absolutely. In fact, somebody on a terrorism list, I wouldn't even trust. I'd just say verify. So there are a variety of ways of doing that. Some of them involve secret intelligence. Some of them involve talking to people more openly. That's what the State Department does. Essentially, look at the track record. Have there been car bombs? Have there been murders of civilians? Have there been kidnappings? It's like when I met that group of Christians. You do that not one time. You do that 50 times. You do that 100 times. And in a sense, you're triangulating information, trying to determine what's verifiable, what seems like it's well sourced, even if it's not easy to verify, what's lousy source. Don't trust that source at all. And it's a sort of an analytical judgment based on information coming in from a variety of sources. I am never, ever comfortable making a judgment on something like that from one or two sources. Never.
Okay. Actually, there's one other question that they want me to say to the end. It's my understanding on the TV series Diplomat that the lady is actually the female you in foreign policy. Have you? I have not seen the series. Have you seen the series?
So I'm really embarrassed to admit, but neither my wife nor I ever watch television. So we don't even have a Netflix subscription or anything. So we read something called books, and we don't even read them on a Kindle. We get them from a library in paper. So that's how old-fashioned we are. So, but I have heard about the series, and what my friends who do watch it say is that they wish that that ambassadors had as much power as apparently that so-called American ambassador in London has. And second, they say you just have no idea how much nastier the bureaucratic fighting is than what is portrayed in that show.
Well, if we had more time, we'd talk about whether you'd be willing to come back to be ambassador to Lebanon with that great new facility that's being built.
Oh my gosh, isn't that? I mean, that's just sad. Really.
That'll be another discussion another time.
Yeah.
Stan asked about recommend. Charles has a question.
Oh, I missed a hand back here. Also, while I'm going back to get a question here, we have a question for any books that you might recommend that would be good for us to inform us.
So I know very little about China, and I decided I needed to get smart about this whole China debate. And a book by a guy named Elbridge Colby writes a book about China. Colby is spelled C like cat, O-L-B like boy, Y. And the book is called A Policy of Restraint, something like that. And I thought that was a very good book, and it was actually very easy to understand. He didn't go into a lot of like weird background data on China. He really just talked about what does America need and what can we expect as we deal with China. So I liked that book a lot. I have to say, this is more on the history side. I like to read history. The biography of James Baker, who was George Herbert Walker Bush's Secretary of State. He was Ronald Reagan's chief of staff. The Man Who Ran Washington by Peter Baker and his wife, Susan Glasserman. I thought that book was just a terrific description of how Washington used to work reasonably well 25 years ago. It's when you compare how it was then with how it is now, it's just something I wish we could get back to.
All right, we got a question here.
Ambassador Ford, I'm interested in what the Russian presence is in Syria in terms of facilities and personnel, and has that changed at all since they invaded Ukraine?
It's changed a little. I'm going to throw this map back up if I can.
Hang on.
So,
We got it. We got it.
There, thank you.
so if you look on the Mediterranean coast, in the far west of Syria there, in that area that's circled, but on the coast, you'll see there's a Russian flag there, white, blue, and red. And the Russians have two bases there. They have an air base at a place called Hamamim, which is new. That only was built since the Syrian civil war started in 2011. And they have a Navy base at Latakia. The Latakia Navy base goes back about 40 years, very old, but they have updated it and renovated it. The total number of Russian ground forces in Syria is actually very small, probably not more than about 2,000, and it has been reduced because of the war in Ukraine, they have sent some units back. And so with that smaller force, what's actually happened is the Russians turned over many of their positions and checkpoints and roads they controlled. They've turned them over to the Iranians. And there's, in a sense, I think there's more coordination between the Russians and the Iranians now in Syria than there was, say, 2 or 3 years ago. The Ukraine war and the vigorous Western response against Ukraine has pushed Iran and Iran and Russia much closer together in military cooperation. You've probably heard about Iran, for example, sending drones to help the Russians. And there are now discussions of the Russians providing advanced Russian fighter jets to Iran. So we'll see.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Ford. This has been enlightening. I will mention to you that we will not be leaving the topic of Syria in September. I just found out Mike Singh from the Washington Institute is going to join me in a discussion about all the different countries, their involvement in Syria. We're also going to talk a little bit about the Iran and Saudi Arabia connection. An awful lot of stuff going on in the Middle East right now, isn't there?
Mm-hmm. Really, it's in flux. It's interesting. There's so much frustration with the United States in the Middle East now, in capitals like Riyadh and Abu Dhabi and Cairo, so much frustration that they really have changed their strategies so that they're going to try to cooperate more rather than confront Iran.
Well, I'll be in touch with you to flesh out my questions for Mike when he comes then. So, again, I hope you have a very safe journey here to Central Illinois. Really close. I go by through Champaign a lot down to my farm, so I'll think of you a lot. Again, can we have a hand for the ambassador? And I really appreciate your